የአባይ ውሃ ነው ጠበል የአባይ ውሃ ነው ጠበል ከኢትዮጵያ ገሬ ይፈልጋል ካርቱምንማ ያበላል ግብፅም ምድር ላይ ያበቅላል የአባይ ውሃ ነው ጠበል ከኢትዮጵያ ገሬ
Just to introduce myself, Juan Kidani. I'm a professor of law at Seattle University Law School. And we're honored today by the presence of a distinguished group of highly qualified panelists to discuss some of the questions raised by this important book. The book's title is How This Happened. And it talks about the Nile's mysteries. And mysteriously, that this probably refers to GERD, it's inside that circle. The GERD is a product of a remarkable human ingenuity and ambition. Now, one of the most eloquent quotations that the author put in the book is the following. It says, by its nature or natural cyclical rhythm and its ever-imposing presence, the Nile embodied continuity and harmony. Conceptualizing the river was often a matter of defining one's identity, of both oneself and the other. Cultural representations of the Nile acquired different forms and contents and were multiplied continually in space and time. From ancient times to the medieval period, and then to the modern and contemporary years, among the Egyptian Delta, the Sudanese Sud, and the Ethiopian Lake Tana, the Nile always meant different things to different people. It did indeed mean different things to different people. On 22nd July 2020, Ethiopians across the world celebrated the completion of the first round of filling, which deposited 5.4 billion cubic meters of water. And the book calls it the beginning of the beginning. What has just begun? The question that the book asks is how. It doesn't say anything about why or who. Let's continue. On October 23rd, 2020, the former president, President Trump, said Egypt will end up blowing up the dam. They should have stopped it long before it started. And of course, that followed a statement by the foreign minister of Egypt to the United Nations Security Council on the 29th of June 2020. And here is what he said. The unilateral filling and operation of the dam, without an agreement that includes precautions to protect downstream communities, would heighten tensions and could provoke crises and conflicts that further destabilize the already troubled region. And of course, the beginning of the beginning provoked Ambassador Seleshi Bagala. He is credited for having coined the term, "It's my dam." It's seen, as the book says, on bumper stickers, office windows, public billboards throughout the country. School children saved dimes, elderly sold their belongings to contribute to the construction of the dam. In general, the GERD became a national pride. And of course, the Security Council, in an unprecedented move, considered the issue a matter of national world security, but eventually end up referring the matter to the African Union. And the African Union required the formulation of a binding agreement. All of these things touch upon the law and the politics of the Nile. Today, the most intimately involved individuals are here among us to discuss the law and politics of the Nile. And as I said, the question that's raised is how, but there is one fundamental question that implicitly raises, which is, who has the burden of justifying the Nile, the GERD? And of course, the GERD punctuates the river Nile. It's a remarkable development. Now, we are joined by, first of all, Ambassador Seleshi, who is Ethiopia's ambassador to the United States. Ambassador Seleshi has served in high government positions for an extended period of time. He was the Minister of Water and Irrigation in Ethiopia before becoming the ambassador. Above all, Ambassador Seleshi is a prolific author and an academic. He was the dean of one of the most known engineering faculties in Ethiopia, the Arba Minj University. Some of your students, ambassadors, I know are watching, and they're proud of you. Some of your students are actually in leading positions now in the construction of the GERD itself. And Ambassador Seleshi will discuss the status of the GERD and also talk a little bit about the negotiation process. And the next speaker is Ambassador Shin. Ambassador Shin has 37 years of working for the State Department in different diplomatic posts, including as ambassador to Burkina Faso and Ethiopia. And Ambassador Shin is also an academic, a prolific author. He's authored several books, and he's currently a professor at the Elliott School of International Affairs at George Washington University. Our third speaker is Mr. Safa Selassie Lama. He's a seasoned lawyer who has practiced the law of the Nile for more than 3 decades, and he's now a practicing attorney based in Washington, D.C. and Virginia. He's also a member of Ethiopia's negotiating team, and I cannot think of a better person to describe the law of the Nile than him. Each speaker will have 8 minutes for their initial remarks, and I will ask 1 or 2 questions and then open it up for broader discussion with the audience. Thank you very much, and Ambassador Seleshi, you have the floor.
Good afternoon. Thank you very much for the introduction. To start with, I would like to congratulate my friend, a real friend. We are in the same high school. Continue our friendship to achieve this successful book launching. Obviously, it's very clear. You can see the content of the book covering the whole aspects of what is important with respect to Nile and Grand Ethiopia Renaissance Dam. I really appreciate this motivation and effort to achieve this. This is not simple. I also thank Georgetown University for hosting this important event. I also supporting Professor Daraje to deliver on this. The limited period of time, I wouldn't go to various issues, but I will go directly to what is asked. Currently, the Grand Ethiopia Renaissance Dam is at 91% completion. This year, it's going to fill the 4th round of filling of the dam. The filling itself is a very contentious issue. In fact, Grand Ethiopia Renaissance Dam shouldn't have been a contentious issue because it is a pure hydropower development project. Projects that doesn't consume water but stores and redistributes the hydrology, which is unimodal peak. That happens within 3 months of rainfall, falling period, to the extended annual, equal distribution type of releases. This dam basically is the least controversial. Although many people call it a controversial dam, it's the least controversial because water belongs to all the riparian country people. People need to use it for their socio-economic development and benefits. There is no one single country on or one part of the community within Nile Basin that should benefit from the river, but all those who are actually the source of water, as well as also riparian countries in the downstream up to the mouth of the river, must benefit from it. Why hydropower is least controversial? As I've said, it doesn't consume water, but one has to be careful that it doesn't cause significant harm during the filling stage. That is where you have to be careful. Unfortunately, the Nile, the status quo is not governed by what is traditionally known as international law for managing transboundary rivers, but it is was controlled by mainly the two downstream countries. So it's basically about control of the water, not that Ethiopia harms its downstream neighbors because of Grand Ethiopia Renaissance Dam. The dam itself, 91% completion, is the entire width of 1.8 kilometers for the main dam and maximum of 145 meters above the bed. Is the middle section at 600. By completion of the dam, it has to be 645. Since the end of February, we started the fourth round of middle section rising, and it is by now already surpassed 610 meters. This year's target is 620 meters. So with that, we can fill the next round, which is called fourth round of filling of the dam. So far, the dam has produced energy with using 2 turbines. It's already very useful input into the power grid in Ethiopia. But the dam controls the water which comes during the rainy season in a significant quantity, and majority of it, more than 80%, flows during this period. It means it creates havoc into the downstream country, particularly in Sudan, by causing flood normally. So this has already produced a benefit to the people of Sudan by controlling the amount of flood that is going downstream. The maximum one we have taken from the river was last filling period. It's about 13.2 billion meter cube. Had that been added on the natural flood or the flood that is occurred in the Sudan last year, it would have been extremely disastrous for Sudan and Khartoum. So it has already proven its benefit not only for power generation, but also for flood control. And during drought as well, since it stores water, live storage of 59 billion meter cubes that actually annually renewed, and the maximum feeding of 74 billion meter cube of water. It's very useful, particularly when drought years comes. We know in our region there is a cyclical drought every 7 years or so. Serious drought happens. So during this period, the stored water can benefit the downstream because Ethiopia utilizes the reserve storage to generate electricity. Because of this as well, the downstream countries benefit out of it as they will receive more water than that naturally occurs during this drought period. The dam has also another special feature, which is called the side dam or shoulder dam, which is actually very big dam, 5.1 kilometer long and 50 meter height at its maximum depth. So that is already complete. So various components, the civil work is over 97% completion. Similarly, the machine part, that means where we install turbines and the like, has also almost 70%. And also hydraulic steel structure work is also in 60s, in the 60%. So we are moving, as described earlier, we'll be completing within 2 years the entire construction. That is what we call the progress of the dam. Once completed, for Ethiopia, it will generate, with a capacity of 5,150 megawatt, a total of 15.7 terawatt hour per year. There has been some modification and optimization of the generation capacity, but the energy it produces will be the same as whether you produce using 16 turbines or 13 turbines as currently being under construction. So this will be very, very important for Ethiopia, where in a country where 65 million or so people are living under darkness without access to electricity. You know, electricity is a basic infrastructure that goes across entire social economy, be it water supply, addressing gender issue, health, agricultural production, industrialization, tourism, etc. You need energy. You need reliable electricity. That is one significant benefit for it. It's just like Hoover Dam, when it was completed in 1940, it has transformed the United States socio-economic situation. It goes beyond just generating electricity for Ethiopia. It also benefits the neighboring countries. We can count a number of dozens of benefits, actually, just from the context of electricity alone. It can be connected to Sudan, Djibouti, entire Nile Basin countries. We have already interconnection with Kenya, up to 2,000 megawatt. Infrastructure is completed. A few months back, we started interconnecting to Kenya. Since few years, we are already interconnected with Sudan, as well as Djibouti, and other neighboring countries also interconnect to the East African power pool or power grid. So it means the energy generated within Ethiopian territory is not necessarily means only for Ethiopia, but to bring up the poverty-stricken region to next level of socio-economic development. So the energy is relatively cheaper. The technology, well-proven technology, but looking at sustainability dimensions, sustainable development goals, and climate change issues, you can see also has immense benefits. To realize other types of renewable energy, like the wind energy, solar energy, etc., which are normally intermittent, this will have a very significant stabilizing effect because it's bold and significant. It can be utilized in on and off mode whenever it is needed, but others are variable energy. For example, sunlight doesn't exist in the night, therefore in the night you can operate hydropower. In the day, the entire solar energy as renewable resource can be utilized. So it will have a very significant meaning in terms of climate change. Given my time is very limited, I can't go in a lot of details, but this is really a very, very important project for Ethiopia. I would like to just mention a few things on the negotiation dimension. The negotiation currently, it has never stopped, basically. You hear a news here in the social media mentioning that negotiation has stopped. No, it hasn't stopped. We have been engaged. The only latest thing is it has to go back to African Union mechanism, and we have to really look into at the African Union facilitation solutions. Under that context, the three countries are meeting from time to time. Well, the history, all of you have been following it. It has encountered serious challenge under the condition where we don't have an agreed, an equitable type of agreement. The agreement that exists is between Sudan and Egypt, which completely takes water apportion between the two countries, which Ethiopia never recognized, and all riparian countries have never recognized as well. except the two. The only agreement we have is therefore the declaration of principle. The three leaders from Sudan, Ethiopia, and Egypt have concluded a declaration of principle how to really manage the issue of GERD. It's not about complete water agreement allocating water to the riparian countries from the Nile, but to look into how to fill the dam and operate the dam. Has got 10 articles. One of the articles focuses on filling and operation of the dam. The rest are, supplementary articles that, support, enhance relationship and partnership around the Nile. So in that context, the filling of the dam is almost getting complete. It hasn't caused any problem. In the remaining two, filling periods also will be careful. For those also, we have already a negotiated type of filling numbers, which doesn't cause significant harm for any of the countries. Based on that, we'll continue filling, and nothing to be, worried about it. In terms of operation, as I've said, in flood years, it will be beneficial to reduce flood. In dry years, it will even add value into the downstream countries because it releases more water than what nature gives during that particular year. So going forward, what we can see is the negotiation is the only way out. And for sustainability in future, we have to look into what will be best agreement for all the riparian countries. We have gone through not only declaration of principle, but CFA, which is signed by 6 countries and ratified by 2, maybe Sefa can talk more on it. But for future, we have to really all 11 riparian countries come to a certain conclusive agreement in order to resolve the issue of Nile once for all. Nobody can survive without having water to drink, to produce energy, to produce. So all of us need it. It cannot be monopolized by one over the other. So the final word is we have to really sit earnestly, negotiate to resolve the challenge that they has to one another. Thank you very much.
Our next speaker is Ambassador Shin.
Ambassador Seleshi, Otto Dereji, distinguished guests, the geopolitics of the Nile Basin involves many actors, and unfortunately is often complicated from time to time with the outbreak of conflict in one or more parts of the basin area. Ethiopia, Sudan, and Egypt are the most important Nile Basin actors. The Nile provides about 95% of the water flowing into Egypt, making it critical to the survival of the country. But as much as 85% of the water reaching Egypt originates in Ethiopia. The Blue and the White Nile meet at Khartoum in Sudan, making Sudan an important link between Ethiopia and Egypt. Egypt's position on Nile water issues is well known and clear. I won't belabor it. It wants no change in the existing treaties dealing with Nile waters, and it opposes large upstream dam construction such as the GERD. Historically, Egypt, or at least individual Egyptian officials, have occasionally taken a threatening position on the Nile water disputes, including the possible use of force. Sudan's position on Nile water issues has varied over the years, shifting between support for Egyptian and Ethiopian points of view. Former Sudanese President Omar al-Bashir favored construction of the GERD but later wavered as relations with Ethiopia deteriorated. Sudan's post-Bashir transitional civilian government tried to pursue a middle path between the Ethiopian and the Egyptian positions. The military government, following the 2021 coup in Sudan, supported Egypt's position. But Ethiopia's prime minister visited Khartoum early this year when the Sudanese military leader said Sudan was in full agreement with Ethiopia on all issues concerning the GERD. The two other most important upstream countries in the Nile Basin are South Sudan and Uganda. Egypt and Ethiopia have both worked hard to earn their support on Nile water issues. I would conclude that Ethiopia appears to have the advantage in both cases. South Sudan signed a memorandum of understanding with Ethiopia to receive 500 megawatts of electricity from the GERD over the next 6 years. Uganda and Ethiopia are aligned on the Entebbe Agreement, also known as the Cooperative Framework Agreement, that permits upstream countries to build dams on the Nile without seeking the approval of downstream countries. Egypt, on the other hand, is supporting a number of development projects in Uganda, which provide some leverage in the country. The African Union, which includes all the 10 Nile Basin countries as members, has pursued a publicly neutral position on Nile water issues, but is probably more sympathetic to Ethiopia's position. Not surprisingly, Ethiopia favors African Union efforts to facilitate negotiations among Ethiopia, Sudan, and Egypt to resolve outstanding issues concerning the GERD. The Arab League strongly supports the Egyptian position on Nile water issues and the Sudanese position when it is in sync with that of Egypt. In 2023, Ethiopia expressed dissatisfaction with the Arab League resolution regarding the filling and operation of the GERD, adding that the management and use of the Nile water should be left to those parties in Africa itself. Moving to actors far away from the region, but who have the ability to influence Nile water issues in international forums, the European Union in 2021 regretted Ethiopia's second filling of the GERD without reaching a prior agreement with downstream countries before doing so. The European Union supported the African Union-led talks and said it was ready to play a more active role in the dispute if requested by all parties. In 2022, the European Union and Egypt issued a joint statement on a wide range of issues. The joint statement reiterated support for the African Union-led talks, but it also welcomed the UN Security Council presidential statement that had the following language, quote, regarding reaching a mutually acceptable and binding agreement on the filling and operations of the GERD, unquote. Ethiopia quickly objected to the EU's, quote, biased stance on the GERD, unquote, and called it not acceptable. India, whose position on the GERD is determined by its own transboundary water issues, has avoided comment on the GERD, but made it clear that it opposes transboundary water issues on the agenda of the UN Security Council. Consequently, India's views tend to be in sync with the Ethiopian position that also opposes UN Security Council intervention. Turning to Russia, in 2019, Russia said it was ready to mediate differences on the GERD between Egypt and Ethiopia. In 2021, Russia was actually critical of Egypt in the UN Security Council for threatening to use force in resolving differences on the GERD. Most recently, Russia, because of significant interests in both Egypt and Ethiopia, has tried to walk a fine line on the issue so that it does not damage its position in either Egypt or Ethiopia. China, which has close relations with Ethiopia, Egypt, and Sudan, has been careful to avoid taking sides on the GERD issue. China provided a loan of $1 billion to help finance the transmission lines to and from Addis Ababa, and provided $1.8 billion of financing for Ethiopia's electricity grid. China calls for restraint and encourages a negotiated settlement of any GERD disagreements. It has demonstrated no interest in mediating the issue. And finally, the United States. The United States, frankly, didn't pay an awful lot of attention to the GERD issue until the Trump administration, at which time the United States tried to mediate differences on the GERD involving Ethiopia, Egypt, and Sudan. These efforts failed when Ethiopia perceived, I think correctly, that Washington favored the Egyptian position. The Biden administration determined not to make the same mistake and supports the African Union-led process while offering technical assistance to improve water usage throughout the Nile Basin. And that is a quick summary of the geopolitics of the Nile Basin issues, and I thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Pastor Shen. And now on the law, Sir Lim.
The international water law is a very vast area. I'd like to focus on some of the basic theories, doctrines, and principles that constitute international water law as it stands now. I'll identify three basic theories. The first one is the theory of absolute territorial sovereignty. According to this theory, the state that the water is located in has an absolute right to utilize the resource without due regard to the interests of the down-riparian countries. Like all natural resources, like fuel, minerals, and everything else, the riparian country has all the right to utilize the resource, irrespective of the interest of downstream countries. Contrary to this theory is a theory of territorial integrity, which advocates the position that the down-riparian countries have a right that they have acquired over the years, that the upper riparian countries have no right to interfere in the natural flow, so they are entitled to whatever they used to be getting. Any interference in the natural flow of that water would amount to a violation of its territorial integrity. Therefore, they would like to maintain a veto power over the entire resource. These are the two extreme positions. They have served their purpose in the old days, when the population was not that big, the need was not that high, the appreciation of the fact that the resource is finite is very unlimited. But as population grew, society developed, then the confrontation came to the front. That's the time when a compromise formula was needed. And that compromise formula is the theory of limited territorial sovereignty. There is a hybrid of the two extreme principles or doctrines or theories, or it is a compromise between the two. This is the theory that recognizes that the resource belongs to all the riparian countries. They are entitled to use it in an equitable way or equally. So whether it's an upper riparian country or a down riparian country, they can utilize it only if they take into account the interests of other riparian countries. There is this theory of limited territorial sovereignty that served as a basis for the pillars, the principles that are considered pillars of the modern international water law. There are several principles, but I would like to focus on two basic principles. The first principle is the principle of equitable utilization. The principle of equitable and reasonable utilization. This principle advocates that all riparian countries have a right to utilize this resource in an equitable and reasonable manner. There is a concept of equity and reason. It doesn't necessarily have to be equal, but they have all the right to utilize it in an equitable and reasonable manner. Inbuilt in this principle is the idea of not causing significant harm to the down riparian countries. But because down riparian countries insisted on having another principle to give them an extra layer of protection, they came up with the principle of no significant harm. This principle advocates that an upper riparian country should not cause significant harm to the down riparian countries in the process of utilizing its resource. So these two principles, the principle of equitable utilization and the principle of not causing significant harm, constitute the basic pillars of modern international water law. This doesn't mean that the principle of absolute sovereignty or territorial integrity have fallen into disuse and they're not invoked anymore. They do get invoked. One example is, for instance, when Egypt claims historical rights over its current use or prior use. That's essentially a code word for the principle of territorial integrity. And also, sometimes countries like Turkey may claim that they have an absolute right over the resource that flows through their territory that is akin to the principle of absolute sovereignty. So generally, we can consider them as fallen into disuse or being rejected by the international community. But at times, we see that when the negotiation gets heated, they bring them up. So these principles, the principle of equitable utilization and not significant harm, constitute the pillars of international water law, as I said earlier. But there are also other principles, like the principle of general cooperation, the principle of peaceful settlement of disputes, which is a general principle of international law, but also parts of the international water law principle, nonetheless. But generally,
From the perspective of an international water lawyer, the two basic principles that have attained the status of customary international law are the principle of equitable utilization and no significant harm. How are these two principles viewed by the Nile riparian countries? The CFA negotiation, the Cooperative Framework Agreement, started in 1997, and the agreement was signed in 2010. That's about 13 years. The first time the negotiation started around 1997, 1998, the time coincided with the making of the UN Convention on Transboundary Water Resources. But first, these very principles were the subject of negotiation among the riparian countries. There was no agreement on which principles to identify, but eventually, as negotiation progressed, consensus was built around these two basic principles, and the two basic principles were incorporated in the Cooperative Framework Agreement around the time the Nile Basin Initiative was formed or established. Then GERD came along, and the Declaration of Principles had to be signed. Because there was already an agreement on these two basic principles, all they had to do was roll over these two principles into the Declaration of Principles. The Declaration of Principles then requires the parties to enter into rules and guidelines on the filling and operation of the Grand Renaissance Dam. It's an ongoing, still, as Ambassador Slishi talked about, it's an ongoing process, but I would say there is very little disagreement over these two basic principles. All riparian countries, all the Nile riparian countries, including Egypt and Sudan, agree on these two basic principles. There is no difference, no disputes over these two principles, even in the GERD negotiations. The problem with these two principles is the understanding and interpretation of these two principles. Everybody agrees to equity and reason. No one had conflict with these two issues, but because the concepts are too elastic and provide some flexibility, in fact, that's the very reason that parties manage to agree to these principles, but interpretation is the one that's holding the parties from arriving at an agreement. Generally, about a minute or two, these two basic principles, the principle of equitable utilization and the not significant harm, despite their limitations, have served the parties in creating a general framework in guiding the negotiations. They have given them a framework not only for the negotiations, even in developing their own projects, they have a frame of reference whether when the country tries to introduce a project, the first thing it asks itself is, would this be equitable and reasonable? And the down riparian countries' reference would be, would I be significantly harmed to this project or not? So it has this purpose. And going forward, there is the hope that these two principles would continue to guide the parties in their negotiation. If an agreement is not to be attained, they will still continue to guide the parties in identifying their projects and using this as a common reference. And beyond that, in the event that parties fail to agree on an agreement, even on a project, and have to seek the involvement of a third-party adjudication, the adjudicators would resort to this principle and resolve the issues.
Thank you very much. So, before we open it up for discussion with the audience, I'd like to ask each one of you at least one question. I'll start with Ambassador Saleshi. It's been indicated that Sudan's position has varied depending on the political circumstances. And now with what is emerging out of Khartoum, do you anticipate that this would actually affect the negotiation process? And if it does, in what direction?
Unfortunate situation in Sudan is really not something we expected, and it's a bad development. We hope that the Sudanese people achieve their peace the soonest. Obviously, this kind of situation always affects negotiations and issues that are considered at national level. So the direct answer is yes, it will delay negotiation, but I don't expect this conflict will continue forever, but Sudan will attain its normality soon, and we pray for that. And once that is achieved, that it can go back to the negotiation. Basically, in terms of the border construction, there isn't much remained, because based on what surfaces equitable and reasonable utilization without causing significant harm, we know how to fill the dam. In the three countries document, we find the same numbers, how much we fill every year, because it is designed by scientists from the three countries. 15 scientists put sit together, 5 from Ethiopia, 5 Sudan and Egypt as well, and design that filling strategy. In terms of operation also, we know how to manage the reservoir. Basically, there isn't as such a controversial issue that provokes into other serious contention. What is remained in the negotiation is basically how to look into the future. GERD shouldn't entangle itself, or the GERD negotiation shouldn't entangle itself with the context of future development, but what is demanded in this operation and filling agreement, there are involved numbers, and those involved numbers may indicate, allocation of water or things like that may complicate the future. As a result, we couldn't come up with a conclusive, guidelines for the three countries. So otherwise, for immediate proceeding into completion of the dam as well as the start operation, we have already the instrument at hand. Yes, in Sudan context, there have been various positions during al-Bashir era and during the transition, and as well as during the recent 2 years. So, however, recently we have also made a conclusion in how to share data and information, because Sudan at the border of Ethiopia has a dam. Ethiopia with Grand Ethiopia Renaissance Dam towards the border of Sudan has this big dam. So the two dams now working together in terms of data exchange, and basically it goes to the resolution of daily labor. Therefore, there isn't any worrying matter for both dams. So as a result, as I said, we pray for Sudan to return back to normality and establish peace, and we take it.
Thank you very much, Ambassador Saleshi. My next question is to Ambassador Shin. Ambassador Shin, you're quoted in this book on page 123 as saying, playing political hardball with Ethiopia will not only fail to obtain Washington's desired result, he said this during Trump, but will probably ensure that the Ethiopian diaspora in the United States rallies against Trump. And you accurately predicted that there are sizable Ethiopian American communities in key states such as Georgia, Texas, and Virginia. My question to you is, do you believe that U.S. policy towards the Nile varies depending on who is in the White House?
Well, it clearly did vary from the prior to the Trump administration to the Trump administration. I think the Trump administration was an anomaly. Up to that time, there just had been minimal interest in pursuing the issue of the Nile. Quite frankly, I can remember back to my time serving as ambassador in Ethiopia in 1996 to 99, where at one point I tried to get the Clinton administration to take more interest in it, at least from the standpoint of looking at it from how it might become a conflictual issue that would impact American interests in the region. And there was zero interest in that, absolutely no interest at all. I think in part because the U.S. did have good relations at the time with both Ethiopia and with Egypt, much less so with Sudan. The relationship with Sudan was not very, very good at that time. And it just didn't want to get in the middle of anything. So I think that tended to be the policy of successive administrations up to Trump. And it was almost an anomaly that the Trump administration got involved in it. It's my understanding that it got involved as a result of a personal request from President el-Sisi to President Trump. And I think that the Treasury Secretary was present at the same time to mediate the issue. And President Trump said, sure, why not? And turned to the Treasury Secretary to lead the effort. Now, the Treasury Secretary has nothing to do with Nile water issues. That was why it was all so strange. And nevertheless, the Treasury took it on. The State Department was largely absent. Well, it's overstating the case, but they were not a key player in all of this. And it did not go well. At which point Trump ends his term in office. No progress is made in terms of outside mediation. And the Biden administration comes in and they are following a different tack. So it's not that there's constant switching back and forth in American administrations. It's that you had an anomalous situation with the Trump administration.
Thank you very much. And lastly, my legal question is, it appears that there is some consensus around some of the basic substantive principles. And the interpretation of these principles may be problematic, and their application to the set of facts that exist on the ground could also be problematic. When the ascertainment of the meaning of any substantive law arises, ordinarily under international law, states invite a third-party decision maker, be it the ICJ or an arbitral tribunal. Does Ethiopia fear that it has to justify the GERD?
Generally, for all the parties, if you ask Egyptians, Sudan, or Ethiopians, all the parties will tell you that this is a national security issue of the highest order. Each country refers to this issue as an existential issue. So when it is a national issue of the highest order, you would be shy to submit that issue to a third party for adjudication, generally. But when it comes to Ethiopia, generally Ethiopia is confident that if the principle of equitable utilization and no significant harms to apply, I think Ethiopia at least will be able to get more than a 0% share. Because currently, as it stands now, the status quo is such that between Egypt and Sudan, the two of them utilize the entire discharge of the Nile water. In fact, that's the basic problem. Egypt and Sudan accept the principle of equitable utilization because they have no choice, because these principles have evolved into a customary international law. They've been recognized by the ICJ. recognized by state practice, so they have no choice, they have to accept it. But when it comes to implementing these provisions, the outcome would be a certain amount of share going to Ethiopia and other riparian countries that would eventually end up in reducing the amount of water that reaches the down riparian countries. So they don't want to go there. That's the only reason. But as I said earlier, still, even for all the riparian countries, on an issue like the Nile River, subjecting this issue to an international tribunal or international court of justice is a little sensitive. By the way, ICJ has decided only one case. Even in that case, he pushed back the case back to the parties so that they can sort it out through negotiations. But that's.
Thank you.
Yes. I just want to, between the two questions, I want to just add.
Yes, please.
When you came to United States, actually, we didn't came for mediation. Basically, we haven't set up a mediation team up to now. Because I have to really clearly explain this. When we came to the United States, we were invited actually to explain about GERD among the three friendly countries to the United States. We came accepting the invitation, and for 9 rounds, actually, we're continuing our own negotiation in presence of observers, not mediators, observers from the United States, European Union, and South Africa. We continue that for 9 rounds, and then toward the end, this Treasury was involved and World Bank was involved. A position came. We have already seen during these 9 rounds what kind of suggestions and inputs are coming in. It was off the balance. It was not equally looking at the 3 countries in terms of the issue at hand. It's just a project, but it was going beyond the project. It's about becoming about water sharing and water allocation and future water is binding nature of the agreement and which is actually rules and the guidelines, not originally anticipated as agreements. So all this complicated the matter, and at the end, there was a suggestion from the United States government to, particularly from Treasury, to write the agreement for. Now, this, and the sovereign nations, you can't just start writing agreements. We will bring our own proposal, what will bring us together. Egypt can bring, Sudan can bring, and we can harmonize that and finalize the agreement. But this was not accepted. First of all, we haven't accepted the mediation role. Then that became, a point of misunderstanding. We were hoping to come back, bringing our own proposal after 2-3 weeks, but that was not accepted. And then that situation fell apart. And then the next round of pressure on Ethiopia, taking it to Security Council has happened. That's also not a place to negotiate the study development project. So that is returned back to African Union mechanism. Even then, it is a facilitation mechanism. In our declaration of principles, there is a clear statement which says if the parties could not come to conclusion, one of them should file a mediation mechanism or a facilitation mechanism that was not requested by any of the parties, because the party which is demanding mediation should submit to the other 2 parties this request, and the other 2 parties should agree on. But this was not. And the third level, even if we don't finish it under mediation, we have to bring the matter to the head of state. So the head of states should resolve the issue. So all this were not followed, therefore, we have to enter into some kind of vicious cycle. And anyway, all the technical, this is the technical nature. on the technical issues, we came to a very good solution. But what complicates is the issue is the legal side, the implication of what if we resign solution on the future of water. So since that is not clearly discussed and addressed, we couldn't count. I just want to
Very good, sir. Thank you very much. I think we can now open it up for questions. I don't know how much time we have, about 10 minutes, 15? 10 minutes. I'll take questions from the audience.
Hello. Okay. Hi. Thank you. Ambassador and Ambassador. I come to you guys with a few questions, but really just one major question. Obviously, we hope for the best in terms of GERD's development. My family personally are huge supporters of the dam. We're bondholders, and really do wish the best for the future and its continued development. And the discussion we've had has been very enlightening and very informative, and very encouraging to see this development. In my view, however, the next natural step for Ethiopia, and this has also kind of been articulated by the Prime Minister, is in terms of the Nile water usage, is irrigation. And this is, as you all know, a consumptive use of the Nile waters. And looking beyond GERD, in terms of addressing the food security issues in Ethiopia, and then meeting these objectives, how does Ethiopia balance those priorities in the future of meeting its food security objectives, as well as maintaining good relations with its downstream neighbors and managing those impacts? I would just like your insights on that issue as these developments come to fruition. Thank you.
First of all, I would like to say congratulations to Dr. Dareje for the launch of this important book and timely. My question is for Dr. Seleshi. I'm not very much good about international water law, but from my random readings, the international water law only encourages or promotes to remedy negative externalities on the international water. But in your negotiation principles, have you ever tried to address the positive developments like positive externalities, conservation work that you do in the upper stream in the watershed conservation strategies that potentially the Egyptians or the downstream riparian countries possibly compensate for that? Because I ask these questions, the international law is not very clear about this. So is there any mechanism to do that? Thank you.
All right. While you think about questions, let's go ahead and answer some of these. Ambassador Seleshi.
Okay. Thank you for the questions. First of all, in terms of food production in the Nile system, we have to really see where we could produce food using irrigation. There are some potential in Ethiopia that has to be developed because the population is now under 20 million, continuously growing. Food security and food sovereignty is a very serious matter these days. However, GERD is not connected to irrigation development. Whatever you can develop downstream of GERD from Ethiopian side is very small area, not negligible. But basically in Sudan can create from GERD a situation of bread basket beyond its own population. As you know, Sudan is flat and can irrigate a lot, but has to take care of also downstream the needs of Egypt as well. Upstream of GERD, yes, we have some potential, but Ethiopia is not large irrigation potential country like flat countries. 77% of African mountain is in Africa, in Ethiopia. It means it's arid topography. What we could harness as a potential from the Ethiopia side of the Nile is largely hydropower. USBR in 1916, they mentioned the document, has identified 4 different sides. It means U.S. Bureau of Reclamation when it was supporting Ethiopia to develop the Nile water. So those are interesting sides from Ethiopian context. Also as it is related to second question. Ethiopia is very open to invite neighboring countries or foreign direct investment to develop this resource. Egyptian can come, American can come, European can come. I can co-develop this bountiful, well-proven technology-based energy generation that is lying in the Blue Nile or Abai Valley. In the Abai Valley, you can't have any irrigation development because it is gorge. Only the river stream is flowing. Left and right, it is steep slopes. So the future of the region is really to work together, collaborate, create regional integrations through infrastructure development. We have to think of interconnecting our energy system. If it is energy system that helps all the riparian countries, why do we quarrel on? We have to make trade between the countries. We have to look into industrializing and creating jobs for our users all over the countries. Not only just take the issue from egoistic point of view of one single country's interest, but look into the benefit, the broader benefit sharing dimension of such kind of resource. Yes, in terms of watershed management and protecting the basin, we have been in good old days when we're under an NDBI and intro, we're working together. We had various joint multi-purpose projects. Many countries have supported this action, like United States, European, Scandinavian countries, Asian countries support this effort and invested up to $250 million on many types of beneficial projects to the basin. So we have to really rethink how do we bring our region, broadly Africa, out of poverty and live better life than where we are now. We don't need to really go to any type of conflict because of a resource.
Thank you very much. And we have a question from a remote attendance, and I'll just read it. As mentioned by Ambassador Shin, Sudan's position has changed over time. I read about a Sudanese minister in water irrigation going to extreme, stating as Aswan Dam is for Egypt, GERD is for Sudan. I forgot his name, but later we read that there was a 180-degree shift to another extreme. What do you think the reason for Sudan's change of positions from time to time?
My two colleagues on each side may have a better explanation for that than I do, but I think what you have happening to some extent in Sudan is that they're looking at other unrelated issues in terms of their relations with both Egypt and Ethiopia in this case, and those are being factored in to what their position is on Nile waters. For example, if you have a conflict, as Sudan did or still does, on the border with Ethiopia at Peshaga, that is something that it factors into its position on Nile waters. Now, I don't know how thinking goes into this in Khartoum, or what the relative importance of it is, but Sudan is obviously thinking of all of these other issues that are going on at the same time that impact its relationship with Ethiopia. Today, I think it's pretty clear that Sudan is preoccupied with its own internal conflict, and I can't imagine it has much time at all to even think about Nile waters issues. So in that sense, it impacts any decisions just in terms of probably largely ignoring something like Nile waters or the GERD, any negotiations concerning the GERD. I don't want to try to think what the Sudanese authorities are thinking, because I'm not in their heads, but I think there's a lot going on that does impact their decision making vis-a-vis Ethiopia that's not directly related to the GERD or to Nile waters.
Sudan's position is different from Egypt because Sudan is an upper riparian and a down riparian country at the same time. So they have the luxury of keeping on changing their mind whenever that's so purpose.
Should we conclude with, okay, just one more question. Yes.
I'm Dr. Master Celestian and the other panelists. I'm not an expert on water, international water agreements or transboundary agreements. But from my understanding, the Egyptians are saying something like they need guaranteed something like 55 billion cubic meters of water has to reach their dam each year. And that's their position, requiring the upstream country, mainly Ethiopia, to meet that requirement. Now, the Ethiopians have not signed any agreement on water sharing or water allocation with Egypt. So where does the international law fit? Can a downstream country demand by law that Ethiopia meets certain needs, or is that outside the boundaries of law? Where does their argument go in terms of legal questions? How can they make this argument? What's the foundation of it?
I mentioned earlier that this is more akin to the theory of territorial sovereignty, where the down riparian countries want to maintain monopoly over the resource. Coming back to the 1959 argument, number one, that argument doesn't exist at all. Under the Vienna Convention of the Law of Treaties, it's not binding on any other riparian country other than Egypt and Sudan. Even for Egypt and Sudan, the professor can correct me, under contract law, for the contract to be valid, there has to be an object. You can't enter into a contract on a property that you don't own. Sudan and Egypt divided the entire flow of the water, which they don't own, between the two of them. So the contract is void ab initio to begin with. So it just doesn't exist. So that's the reason they have absolutely no justification. That's why they're avoiding the implementation of the principle of equitabilization, despite the fact that they have accepted it in all these arguments. But there is no basis in law and in fact as well.
Well, unfortunately, we don't have our Egyptian colleagues among us, and I would suppose that they would probably disagree with that conclusion. But Ambassador Salishi, do you have any final thoughts to share with us?
Well, on this question,
generally, just
if you look at the Nile water flow, where does it come from? From Ethiopia, up to 77 billion cubic meter. When one country takes 55, another 18.5, environment takes 10, nothing is left for the originator of the water. Position is not valid from the start. So we have to keep in mind this. Finally, I would like to come back to thank the Reggie and his family to produce this excellent book. So we should be a very good reference. I'm sure many books will be generated in the future on many directions. Thank you very much for writing as well as organizing this nice event.
የአባይ ውሃ ነው ጠበል የአባይ ውሃ ነው ጠበል ከኢትዮጵያ ገሬ ይፈልቃል ካርቱምንማ ያበላል ግብፅም ምድር ላይ ያበቅላል የአባይ ውሃ ነው ጠበል ከኢትዮጵያ ገሬ